The morning sun cast long shadows across the flight deck of the Akagi as Admiral Chuichi Nagumo gazed toward the eastern horizon. His combined fleet stretched magnificently across the Pacific waters: 4 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The most powerful naval force Japan had ever assembled, yet something gnawed at the edges of his confidence like salt corroding steel. "Admiral," Captain Taijiro Aoki approached with the latest intelligence reports clutched in his weathered hands. "Our reconnaissance confirms American forces are concentrated at Pearl Harbor. The path to Midway remains clear." Nagumo nodded, but his expression remained troubled. 6 months had passed since their devastating surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. 6 months of unbroken victories across the Pacific. The Philippines had fallen, the Dutch East Indies conquered, Singapore captured. Japan's empire stretched from the Aleutians to the Solomon Islands, yet Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto insisted they needed one final decisive battle to crush American naval power forever. The plan seemed flawless on paper. Operation MI would simultaneously strike Midway Atoll, while a diversionary force attacked the Aleutian Islands, drawing American attention north. Once Midway fell, the Americans would be forced to respond with their remaining carriers, walking directly into Yamamoto's trap. The combined fleet would then annihilate the Pacific Fleet in a climactic surface engagement, forcing America to negotiate peace. But intelligence reports troubled Nagumo. American radio intercepts had increased dramatically in recent weeks, suggesting unusual activity. Their submarines had been spotted with suspicious frequency near Japanese installations. Most concerning of all, the Americans seemed to be moving, with purpose, rather than the desperate improvisation expected of a defeated enemy. "Sir," Lieutenant Commander Minoru Genda, Nagumo's air operations officer, interrupted his thoughts. "The first wave is ready for launch. 108 aircraft will strike Midway at 0630 hours. As Nagumo watched the Nakajima, torpedo bombers and HE dive bombers thunder off the flight deck into the dawn sky, he couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in this war. The Americans had absorbed Pearl Harbor's devastating blow, yet they hadn't collapsed as predicted. Instead, they seemed to be hardening like steel in a forge. Unknown to Nagumo, his every move was being monitored from a concrete bunker deep beneath Pearl Harbor. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his cryptanalysis team had broken the Japanese naval code weeks earlier, giving Admiral Chester Nimitz unprecedented insight into enemy intentions. The Americans knew exactly when and where the Japanese would strike. According to declassified naval intelligence documents from the National Archives, the code-breaking effort at Station Haipo had been working around the clock since April 1942 to penetrate Japanese communications. 300 miles northeast of Midway, Admiral Raymond Spruance's Task Force 16 maintained strict radio silence as the carriers Enterprise and Hornet cut through the morning swells. Behind them, Admiral Frank Fletcher's Task Force 17 followed with the Yorktown, hastily repaired after the Battle of the Coral Sea just weeks earlier. The trap was indeed set, but not as the Japanese Admiralty had envisioned. Instead of walking into Yamamoto's ambush, the Americans had positioned themselves to deliver a counterpunch that would reshape the entire Pacific War. The rising sun that had symbolized Japanese ascendancy was about to set on their naval supremacy forever. As the first Japanese bombs began falling on Midway's sandy runways, the greatest carrier battle in naval history was about to unfold. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga pulled back on his control stick as his Nakajima bomber climbed away from Midway Atoll, black smoke trailing from his starboard engine. Below, the American outpost burned fiercely, but not with the complete destruction he had hoped to achieve. Anti-aircraft fire had been surprisingly intense, and American fighters had risen to meet them with unexpected ferocity. "Akagi, this is Tominaga," he radioed back to the flagship. "First attack completed, but second strike will be necessary to neutralize remaining defenses. Repeat, second strike required." Aboard the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo received this message with growing unease. His plan had called for Midway to be completely neutralized in a single devastating blow, clearing the way for invasion forces. Now precious time would be lost preparing another strike, time that left his fleet vulnerable to counterattack. "Sir," Captain Aoki reported urgently. American aircraft approaching from the northeast. Estimated 40 torpedo bombers. Nagumo rushed to the bridge wing, raising his binoculars toward the horizon. There, skimming low over the wave tops, came a formation of obsolete Douglas Devastator torpedo bombers from the Enterprise and Hornet. His heart should have lifted at the sight. These aircraft were death traps, slow and vulnerable, their crews flying virtual suicide missions. Yet their very presence meant something far more ominous. American carriers were operating nearby. 3. Combat air patrol of Zero fighters fell upon the approaching devastators like wolves among sheep. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay's Torpedo Squadron 6 was annihilated almost completely, only 4 of 14 aircraft surviving. Torpedo Squadron 8 suffered even worse, with only Ensign George Gay surviving after his aircraft was shot down. The torpedo attacks achieved nothing. Not a single Japanese ship was damaged. But Admiral Nagumo faced an agonizing decision. His flight decks were crowded with aircraft being rearmed for the second strike on Midway. Should he launch them immediately against the island, or rearm them with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes to engage the American fleet he now knew was lurking somewhere beyond the horizon? Order all aircraft rearmed for anti-ship operations, Nagumo commanded after painful deliberation. We must locate and destroy the American carriers. It was a fateful decision that would consume precious minutes as ordnance crews frantically switched weapons on the crowded flight decks. Bombs were rolled below decks while torpedoes and armor-piercing projectiles were brought up from the magazines. Aviation fuel lines snaked across the hangar decks as fighters were refueled. The Japanese carriers had become floating ammunition, dumps primed for catastrophe. High above this frantic activity, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey circled in his Douglas Dauntless dive bomber, leading 37 aircraft from the Enterprise's bombing and scouting squadrons. He had been searching for the Japanese fleet for over an hour, fuel running dangerously low, when he spotted a lone destroyer racing northward at maximum speed. The destroyer Arashi had been pursuing the American submarine Nautilus, which had been stalking the Japanese fleet since dawn. McCluskey followed the destroyer's wake like a hunter following tracks, and at 10:24 a.m., the sight that greeted him was beyond his wildest expectations. Spread out below in perfect formation steamed the 4 carriers of the Kido Butai, their flight decks packed with aircraft, fuel lines exposed, ordnance scattered about like a magazine explosion waiting to happen. The Japanese combat air patrol was still low on the deck, having just finished massacring the torpedo bombers, and the fleet was completely unprepared for attack from above. Naval historian Samuel Eliot Morrison later wrote in his official history that the timing of this moment represented one of the most decisive coincidences in naval warfare. "This is it, boys," McCluskey radioed to his pilots. "Attack immediately. Give them hell." What happened next would be remembered as the 5 minutes that changed the war. As the American dive bombers screamed down from 14,000 feet, Admiral Nagumo stood helplessly on his bridge, watching his dreams of decisive victory transform into a nightmare of epic proportions. The first bombs were already falling when the Japanese lookouts finally spotted the diving aircraft. By then, it was far too late to change the course of history. The scream of diving aircraft pierced the morning air like banshees descending from the heavens. Lieutenant Dick Best pulled his Douglas Dauntless into a near-vertical dive toward the Akagi, the Japanese flagship growing larger in his bomb sight with each passing second. Around him, 36 other dive bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown plummeted toward their targets in the most coordinated attack of the Pacific War. Admiral Nagumo stood frozen on the Akagi's bridge as the first bombs struck his flagship. The initial explosion erupted near the midships elevator, sending aircraft and personnel flying like broken dolls. Seconds later, a 1,000-pound bomb punched through the flight deck and detonated in the hangar bay, where fueled and armed aircraft created a secondary explosion that shook the massive carrier like a child's toy. "Damage control to the flight deck," Captain Aoki shouted over the chaos. But his words were lost in the thunderous roar of continuing explosions. Aviation fuel ignited in rivers of flame that raced across the wooden deck planking, while ammunition cooked off in spectacular pyrotechnic displays that sent shrapnel spinning through the superstructure. 2 miles away, the carrier Kaga suffered an even more devastating fate. Lieutenant Commander Richard Best had shifted his attack to avoid overcrowding the Akagi, and his bombs found their mark with lethal precision. 4 direct hits transformed Japan's second-largest carrier into a floating inferno within minutes. Captain Jisaku Okada watched helplessly as his ship's entire complement of aircraft, over 70 fighters and bombers, burned on the hangar deck in a conflagration that reached temperatures hot enough to melt steel. The Soryu, smallest of the Japanese carriers, lasted barely longer. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's bombing squadron from the Yorktown caught her with her flight deck crowded with aircraft being refueled. 3 bombs penetrated her thin deck armor and exploded simultaneously in the hangar bay, creating a firestorm that consumed the ship from within. In less than 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers had been transformed from the most powerful naval striking force in history into burning wrecks. The precision and timing of the American attack seemed almost supernatural. Arriving at the exact moment when the Japanese ships were most vulnerable, their decks crowded with aircraft, fuel lines exposed, and combat air patrol drawn down to sea level. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the air group leader who had commanded the Pearl Harbor attack, lay wounded in the Akagi's sick bay as his ship burned around him. Through the porthole, he could see the Kaga listing heavily to starboard, her flight deck a twisted mass of melted steel and burning aircraft. The sight filled him with a despair deeper than physical pain. How? He whispered to the medical orderly, tending his wounds. How could they know exactly when to strike? The orderly had no answer, but far beneath Pearl Harbor, Commander Joseph Rochefort could have explained the seeming miracle. Japanese radio intercepts had revealed not just their intentions, but their precise timing. American codebreakers had given Admiral Nimitz a window into enemy plans that was nothing short of clairvoyant. Yet even as 3 carriers burned, the battle was far from over. The Hiryu, positioned north of the main formation, had escaped the devastating attack. Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, the most aggressive of Japan's carrier commanders, immediately launched a counterattack with every available aircraft. We will show these Americans that the Imperial Navy does not yield easily, Yamaguchi declared to his staff. Prepare for immediate launch of all operational aircraft. According to Japanese naval records preserved in the Defense Ministry archives, Admiral Yamaguchi's decision to continue fighting rather than retreat represented the last gasp of Japan's carrier aviation offensive capability. As the Hiryu's aircraft thundered off her flight deck toward the American fleet, black smoke from the burning carriers created an artificial twilight over the battlefield. The Americans had delivered their devastating counterpunch, but the Japanese were preparing to strike back with desperate fury. The question now was whether the wounded Yorktown and her consorts could survive the retaliatory blow that was racing toward them across the morning sky. The battle that would determine control of the Pacific was entering its most crucial phase, with both sides having committed everything to this single day of destiny. Admiral Spruance, watching the smoke columns rising from the Japanese fleet through his binoculars, knew that the next few hours would determine whether America's early advantage could be maintained, or whether Japan's legendary fighting spirit would somehow snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi gripped his control stick tighter as his Nakajima bomber approached the American fleet through walls of anti-aircraft fire. Behind him, 17 other aircraft from the carrier Hiryu, all that remained of Japan's once mighty carrier aviation force, pressed their attack against the Yorktown with desperate courage. Admiral Taman Yamaguchi had scraped together this meager strike force from the Hiryu's remaining operational aircraft, knowing it represented Japan's last chance to salvage something from the disaster. 3 of the 4 carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor were now burning wrecks, but Japanese naval tradition demanded they fight to the end. "There!" Kobayashi's observer shouted, pointing toward the American formation. "The flat top! She's turning into the wind!" The Yorktown, Admiral Fletcher's flagship, had detected the incoming attack and was preparing to receive aircraft. Her flight deck bustled with activity as Grumman Wildcats scrambled to intercept the Japanese bombers, while damage control parties stood ready for the inevitable hits. Captain Elliot Buckmaster had fought his ship brilliantly since dawn, but he knew the odds were catching up with them. The Yorktown had been hastily repaired after the Battle of the Coral Sea just weeks earlier, with some damage still unrepaired. Now she faced attack by pilots whose skill and determination had been honed in 6 months of continuous victory. Tyor. First Japanese dive bomber screamed down through the combat air patrol at 11:45 a.m. Lieutenant Kobayashi's bomb struck just abaft the island superstructure, penetrating the flight deck and exploding in the hangar bay. The blast killed or wounded dozens of men and started fires that threatened the aviation fuel storage. 2 more bombs followed in quick succession. The second pierced the smokestack, disrupting the ship's engineering plant and reducing her speed to just 6 knots. The third detonated near the forward elevator, creating a gaping hole in the flight deck that made aircraft operations impossible. Admiral, Captain Buckmaster reported to Fletcher over the ship's communication system. "We've lost power to the elevators and can't conduct flight operations. Recommend you transfer your flag to another ship." Fletcher, his face grim as damage, reports poured in, made the painful decision to shift his command to the cruiser Astoria. As his staff gathered their charts and communications equipment, the Yorktown's crew fought desperately to save their ship. But Japan's agony was far from over. Even as the Yorktown burned, Admiral Spruance was preparing another strike against the sole remaining Japanese carrier. The Enterprise and Hornet had recovered their morning attack groups and were hastily preparing them for a second mission. Lieutenant Commander Earl Gallagher led 24 dive bombers from the Enterprise toward the Hiryu at 5 o'clock that afternoon. Unlike the morning's chaotic but successful attack, this strike was methodical and precise. American pilots had learned valuable lessons about Japanese anti-aircraft tactics and carrier maneuvering. Admiral Yamaguchi watched the approaching aircraft with the fatalistic calm of a samurai facing inevitable death. His ship had fought magnificently, striking back at the Americans when all seemed lost. But now the end was approaching. The Hiryu's combat air patrol had been reduced to just a handful of fighters. Her anti-aircraft ammunition was running low, and her flight deck bore scars from the morning's frantic operations. "Sound general quarters," Yamaguchi ordered quietly. "All hands prepare for air attack." The American dive bombers struck at 5:03 p.m. with devastating accuracy. 4 bombs hit the Hiryu in rapid succession, transforming her flight deck into a sea of flames. Aviation fuel ignited in spectacular explosions that could be seen for miles, while the ship's magazine detonated in a blast that lifted her bow clear of the water. According to the official U.S. Navy battle summary compiled by the Naval War College, the destruction of the Hiryu marked the end of Japan's ability to conduct offensive carrier operations for the remainder of the war. Within an hour, all 4 Japanese carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor were either sinking or abandoned. The Akagi and Hiryu would burn through the night before being scuttled by their own destroyers. The Kaga had already slipped beneath the waves, taking with her over 800 officers and men. The Soryu followed soon after, her hull broken by internal explosions. As darkness fell over the battlefield, Admiral Yamamoto aboard the battleship Yamato faced the most difficult decision of his naval career. His plan for decisive battle had backfired catastrophically. Instead of destroying the American Pacific Fleet, he had lost the core of Japan's carrier aviation in a single day. "Signal all units," he ordered with heavy heart. "Operation MI is canceled. Fleet will retire to base." The order that went out that evening marked more than just a tactical withdrawal. It represented the beginning of Japan's long retreat across the Pacific. The Admiralty had indeed misjudged the American counterpunch, and now the entire empire would pay the price for their miscalculation. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood on the bridge of the super battleship Yamato as twilight painted the Pacific in shades of defeat. Radio reports from the burning fleet created a litany of disaster that seemed impossible to comprehend. 4 fleet carriers destroyed, over 3,000 men dead or missing, and Japan's most experienced naval aviators scattered to the winds, like cherry blossoms in a storm. Admiral, Captain Kameto Kurashima, his chief of staff, approached with the latest damage assessments. "Nagumo reports the Akagi and Hiryu are beyond saving. He requests permission to scuttle both ships." Yamamoto closed his eyes, feeling the weight of empire settling on his shoulders. These were the same carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor with such devastating effect just 6 months earlier. The Akagi had been his flagship when he commanded the First Air Fleet. Now she was a burning wreck, her flight deck twisted by explosions, her hangar bay a furnace that consumed decades of naval aviation expertise. "Permission granted," he whispered, the words barely audible above the wind. 300 miles away, the crew of the Yorktown fought their own desperate battle for survival. Despite catastrophic damage from the Japanese counterattack, Captain Buckmaster's damage control parties had managed to restore partial power and reduce the list that threatened to capsize their ship. "We've got the fires under control forward," reported Lieutenant Commander John Greenbacker, the damage control officer. "But we're taking on water faster than the pumps can handle. I don't know how much longer we can keep her afloat." The Yorktown's agony would continue for another 2 days. On June 6th, while under tow by the minesweeper Vireo, she was struck by torpedoes from the Japanese submarine, I-168. The veteran carrier that had fought at the Coral Sea and Midway finally succumbed to her wounds, taking 68 officers and men with her beneath the Pacific swells. Yet even this final Japanese success could not disguise the magnitude of their defeat. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, rescued from the burning Akagi and evacuated to a hospital ship, later wrote in his diary, "We had been accustomed to victory, but now we learned the taste of defeat. It was more bitter than we could have imagined, though why?" Strategic implications of Midway became clear within days. Japan had lost not just 4 carriers, but over 200 experienced naval aviators whose training had taken years to complete. The pilots who had honed their skills in the skies over China and perfected their techniques at Pearl Harbor were irreplaceable assets that no industrial capacity could quickly restore. Admiral Chester Nimitz, reading intelligence reports in his Pearl Harbor headquarters, understood immediately what had been achieved. "The Japanese Navy has suffered a defeat from which it will never fully recover," he told his staff. "We have gained the initiative in the Pacific, and we must never relinquish it." American losses, while painful, were far more manageable. The Yorktown was irreplaceable in the short term, but American shipyards were already launching new carriers at an unprecedented pace. More importantly, most of her aircrews had been rescued and would fight again with new squadrons. The code-breaking triumph that had made Midway possible remained one of the war's most closely guarded secrets. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team at Station Hypo had provided Nimitz with intelligence that bordered on the supernatural, knowing not just Japanese intentions, but their precise timing and disposition. This advantage would continue throughout the Pacific War, allowing American forces to consistently anticipate and counter Japanese moves. Naval intelligence documents declassified in 1977 revealed that the Japanese never suspected their naval code had been broken, continuing to use compromised communication systems well into 1943. Emperor Hirohito, briefed on the disaster by Naval General Staff, reportedly sat in stunned silence for several minutes before asking, "How could our finest admirals have been so completely deceived?" The answer lay in the fundamental miscalculation that had plagued Japanese strategy from the beginning. Their admiralty had assumed that Pearl Harbor would crush American morale and lead to a negotiated peace. Instead, it had awakened a sleeping giant whose industrial capacity and determination far exceeded anything Japan could match in a prolonged conflict. Admiral Yamamoto, architect of both Pearl Harbor and the Midway operation, understood this better than most. As his battered fleet limped back toward Japan, he confided to his staff, "I fear we have awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with terrible resolve. What we accomplished at Pearl Harbor has been more than repaid with interest." The man who had warned against war with America now faced the consequences of his own tactical brilliance turned against him. The surprise attack doctrine that had served Japan so well had been mastered and improved upon by their enemies, delivered with a precision that had shattered Japanese naval power in a single morning. The morning sun that rose over the Pacific on June 7, 1942, illuminated a fundamentally changed world. Where Japan's combined fleet had steamed in magnificent formation just days before, only oil slicks and scattered debris marked the graves of 4 aircraft carriers and the dreams of empire they had carried. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, evacuated from the burning Akagi with severe injuries, lay in his hospital bed aboard the cruiser Nagoya, staring at the ceiling as reports of the disaster filtered through official channels. The man who had led the Pearl Harbor attack force now faced the impossible task of explaining to Imperial headquarters how Japan's most powerful fleet had been virtually annihilated in a single day. "The Americans knew," he whispered to his aide, Captain Oishi. Somehow they knew exactly when and where we would strike. It was as if they could read our minds. Nagumo's assessment was more accurate than he realized. 3,000 miles away in Hawaii, Commander Joseph Rochefort and his cryptanalysis team were already working on their next intelligence breakthrough, having proven that superior information could overcome numerical disadvantages and tactical surprise. The immediate aftermath of Midway sent shockwaves through the Japanese government. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, meeting with the Naval General Staff, struggled to comprehend how such a comprehensive defeat was possible. Our intelligence assured us that American carrier strength was negligible, he said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. How could they field 3 fleet carriers when our reports indicated they had none available? The answer lay in American industrial capacity and determination that Japanese planners had consistently underestimated. While Japan's admiralty focused on decisive battle, American shipyards were producing vessels at rates that seemed impossible to their enemies. The Essex-class carriers already under construction would soon tip the balance of Pacific naval power permanently toward America. Emperor Hirohito, briefed on the full extent of the disaster, made a rare direct intervention in military planning. The Navy must assume a defensive posture, he declared. We cannot afford another such defeat. This imperial guidance effectively ended Japan's offensive operations in the Pacific, though the war would continue for 3 more years. Admiral Yamamoto, returning to Truk with the remnants of his fleet, faced the most difficult period of his distinguished career. The architect of Pearl Harbor had been outmaneuvered by enemies he had helped create. His staff officers watched him age visibly during the voyage home, the weight of strategic failure etched deep in his weathered features. We achieved tactical surprise at Pearl Harbor, he confided to Captain Kuroshima as the Yamato approached Japanese waters. But the Americans have achieved something far more valuable: strategic surprise. They have turned our own methods against us with results we never imagined possible. The battle's impact extended far beyond military casualties. Japan's civilian population, fed a steady diet of victory announcements since Pearl Harbor, remained unaware of the disaster for weeks. Government censors suppressed all reports of the defeat, maintaining the fiction of continued success even as the empire's strategic position crumbled. According to Japanese wartime records released by the Defense Ministry in 1985, the true extent of the Midway defeat was hidden from the Japanese public until after the war ended. American reaction was markedly different. While operational details remained classified, President Franklin Roosevelt authorized carefully worded announcements that suggested significant success in the Pacific. Public morale, devastated by 6 months of continuous defeats, began its slow recovery with news that American forces had engaged the enemy successfully in the Central Pacific. The strategic initiative had indeed shifted permanently. Within weeks of Midway, American forces launched their first major offensive operation, with the invasion of Guadalcanal. The long, bloody campaign that followed marked the beginning of Japan's fighting retreat across the Pacific, island by island, toward the home islands. Admiral Nimitz, reviewing battle reports in his Pearl Harbor headquarters, understood that Midway represented more than tactical victory. It had demonstrated American ability to match and exceed Japanese naval aviation at its own game. We have learned to fight their kind of war, he told his staff, and we have learned to fight it better than they do. The 4 carriers that burned in the waters off Midway had carried with them more than aircraft and ammunition. They had transported Japan's dreams of Pacific hegemony and decisive victory over the American Navy. Their destruction marked the moment when Japan's admiralty discovered that their fundamental assumptions about American capabilities and resolve had been catastrophically wrong. The counterpunch they had so badly misjudged would echo across the Pacific for the remaining 3 years of war, each successive defeat tracing its origins back to those 5 crucial minutes on the morning of June 4th, when American dive bombers screamed down from a cloudless sky to change the course of history forever. In the end, Japan's greatest tactical success, Pearl Harbor, had created the conditions for their greatest strategic defeat. The sleeping giant had indeed awakened, and his counterpunch would reshape the balance of power in the Pacific for generations to come.